Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. New life, apparently, has been breathed into the China-Japan relationship, with both sides more willing to work on bilateral cooperation. Yang Bojiang, director of the Office of Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, is now visiting Japan at the invitation of Japanese National Security Advisor Shotaro Yachi. The two officials will also hold the 6th China-Japan high-level political dialogue. With trade pressure from the U.S., China and Japan have the opportunity, some say, to take charge of the global trading system. Earlier, I sat down with Takahara Aiko, professor from the University of Tokyo, and Yang Bojiang, a director at the Institute of Japanese Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. They discussed the China-Japan dynamic at this moment. To what extent China-Japan relations is actually to be impacted by a third party, which is the United States? Mr. Takahara, you want to go first?
There are many factors that decide Japan-China relations. One is the international environment, and certainly the American factor is the largest amongst those. And now it's actually working in a positive way as far as Japan-China relations is concerned.
Interesting. Explain, please.
Because whenever China, for example, has trouble with the United States, the traditional diplomatic pattern is to look to Japan, is to extend a friendly hand to Japan. So that's what's been happening ever since the Trump administration started to present a lot of difficult questions to China.
Are you cynical about that approach?
No, I don't think so. I think that's very realistic and pragmatic, and we should make use of that.
For you, Mr. Yang, is that the right pattern described by Mr. Karahata?
We have to admit that Sino-Japanese relationship has been determined to a great extent by the so-called U.S. factor, or the Sino-U.S. relationship, as well as the Japan-U.S. relationship. But on the other hand, we have to point out that nowadays the two countries, I mean China and Japan, their role, I mean, in the whole Asia-Pacific region, as well as in the trilateral relationship among U.S., Japan, and China, are increasing. So the Sino-Japan relationship is not as much as a so-called revival of the U.S. factor as before.
So what exactly, how would you describe the nature now, China-Japan, in a way?
China-Japan relationship has got back to the so-called normal track by the end of last year. And but the fact is, some both in China and overseas point out that this is against the background of the China-U.S. trade friction. It's not correct, because the basic fact is the Sino-Japan relationship is a restoration process started far before Trump's inauguration. It's back to the year 2014. So we can say the U.S. factor.
In 2014?
So we spent 3 years to get the relations back to the normal track. And during the process of the restoration of Sino-Japan relationship, President Trump came into power. Then the trade friction between China and the U.S. happened. So such a basic study can tell us that the U.S. factor does play a role in the restoration of the bilateral relation between Beijing and Tokyo, but it's not the whole.
Mr. Takahara?
Sure, that's very correct. I identify 4 areas of factors that impact on Japan-China relations. One is the international environment. The second area is domestic politics. And the third area is economics. In 2014, the slowing down of the Chinese economic growth rate became more prominent than before. And that's the situation even today. So there's an incentive for China to develop economic relationship with Japan even further. And the fourth area is people's perceptions, emotions towards the other side, especially in recent years. Chinese people's image of Japan is improving so rapidly, and that's also a factor that promotes Japan-China relations.
But the question really is, no matter what the reasons are, is Japan ready to embrace China once again with the kind of world and the region that China has in mind, in a way?
It depends on what China has in mind.
Yeah, from your understanding, what does China have in mind? And why is Japan now quite proactive in interacting with China now?
Well, whatever image the Chinese have, the Japanese people understands the importance of Japan-China relations. So if you do a public survey, 70% of the Japanese, even in the days when the relationship was very tense, 70% of the Japanese answered that Japan-China relations is important.
But the question really is, to what extent would you like to go in order to make sure it is a good relationship?
Well, of course, if possible, we can develop, but we can see some obstacles to the development of the relations, especially in the area of security and over the islands. But there is always two aspects in Japan-China relations. One is the resilient aspect, and the other is the fragile aspect.
The both of you represent the resilient aspect, I would assume.
Absolutely. So people like us, not only us, but everyone has to try and promote the resilient side of things and try to manage and contain the fragile aspect of things. That's what we all should aim for.
And some people even argue, Mr. Yang, this is a critical opportunity right now. The allies of the United States do not necessarily agree with some of the practices or policies these days of the current administration. So China actually could take this opportunity in explaining to the others better and have a bigger ear coming from the others as to what China wants to achieve and what should be China's constructive role. But the question to you, Mr. Yang, is you've been dealing with Japan for decades. Does China understand this? How much or how long a distance would China go in order to make its voice well understood and play what also others consider as a constructive role?
I don't think China's voice or China's stand have been well understood overseas, to be honest, as well as in Japanese society. I don't think so. So we do need to promote our approach to explain our policies as well as strategies, especially in regard to the Sino-Japanese relations. Time has changed, I just mentioned that the Sino-Japanese relations have got back to normal track, but it's not the repeat of history.
Explain, please, sir.
Yeah, because the world has changed a lot in comparison with, for example, 40 years ago or even 20 years ago. And a lot of things we should, against such a new circumstances, to do between China and Japan. One is to enhance the conversations between the two societies, not only the two governments. Since the both China and Japan, their societies have changed a lot, dramatically, especially since the end of the Cold War. Even Chinese society, we are feeling the change almost every day.
Yes.
So the influence of the common people's ideas on foreign policy, on Japan's policy toward China, or on China's policy toward Japan, is now playing a much bigger role than before. The second point is how to promote our, cooperation style. May I say, from a vertical style to a horizontal style.
Explain. You have to explain about that.
Yes. For example, last year, October, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited China. During his meeting with President Xi Jinping, they reached an agreement that the two countries will to jointly support the third party's development. I think this is a significant improvement in Sino-Japanese cooperation history. The third point is to build mutual trust. For example, the Diaoyu Island disputes. Yeah. Of course, the precondition for this issue to be resolved is to admit to the disputes itself. You know, the Japanese official stand so far is not to admit such a sovereignty disputes. If you don't even admit such a disputes exist, the disputes will never be resolved, right? So a lot of things for us to consider about to do jointly from now on.
Japan will host the G20 summit in Osaka this June. Discussions of free trade and WTO reform will certainly top the agenda. So how do these two observers view multilateral mechanisms, and what will be the role of China and Japan in this regard? How can China and Japan enhance cooperation to maintain stability as well as economic prosperity in the region? Let's listen in to uncover their answers. Well, those are certainly important areas to work on, but there are immediate areas that probably China and Japan could work on. The upcoming G20 summit, as well as the WTO trade negotiation and debates. So do you see much common ground when it comes to these two countries' immediate cooperation in these areas and on these occasions, Mr. Takahara?
Sure. We should all agree upon very important principles of international economics, that is free trade, for example, rule of law, for example. These, if Japan and China jointly can argue very forcefully, that is, we are going to produce a force.
But you know, Mr. Takahara, now Japan and U.S. trade negotiation is to take place. Interestingly, right on the footstep of China-U.S. Negotiation pause. So the question really is, knowing the tactics of Mr. Trump and his team's negotiation skills, rather, will Japan be the one that will be persuaded to the camp of the so-called unilateralism and bilateralism only?
No way, no way, because as you know, Japan
I have your word.
Because it's a trading nation.
Country.
You know, we need free trade. We need multilateralism. That's an objective condition in which we live.
Yeah. And Mr. Yang, what about from your side? To what extent is China willing to work, of course, as a scholar, with the Japanese side at the G20 summit, which I understand is likely to be a huge debate going on then, and also particularly about the future order of the trade in the world?
I think both China and Japan have a very strong desire to cooperate or to work together in regard with the WTO reform issue. There is a big potential for the two sides to talk about, to work together in regard with that issue. But the precondition is we have to calmly judge what the Japanese stand is. And yeah, because on one hand, we do a lot of things in common with Japan. For example, as Professor Takahara mentioned, we both benefited from the free trade mechanism so far, and we both played a very big role in maintaining such a freedom system so far. So in that sense, may I say, we have something in common. Yeah, but on the other hand, we don't have. I don't think Japan has the same stance with China in terms like electronic business or network information. Its stance is even closer to that of the United States as well as the European countries. Yeah, not closer to, rather than closer to Chinese stance. So we have to keep our mind cool in the very first place.
There's another important issue about immediate cooperation. That is, what do the two countries have in mind about their vision of the region and beyond? How does Japan look at its potential in the region and probably beyond? how will that coordinate or in disagreement with China's vision so far? Mr. Takahara, knowing both pictures very well, I really want to have your understanding here. What can we expect?
You know, the first point is many Chinese people misunderstand that the Japanese are full of ambitions to become a political power, to become a military power. That's not the case.
I'm not sure whether when you say most of the Chinese people, have you done some survey about that? I have not done a survey, so I can't agree with you.
I've never met a Chinese person who doesn't think that way.
Really? Mr. Yang, do you think that way?
But anyway.
Okay, all right.
Anyway.
You just finished, yeah.
And then Mr. Yang will rebuttal.
What I want to say is the fact is that the Japanese people love the status quo. You know,
which is?
Which is what we have now.
What is?
And as he said, a horizontal, equal partnership amongst all the nations without any military development, you know, peace as the main melody in the region. We have maintained peace very well for a very long time, even though Japan was the outstanding power, but it did not develop its military power, and people are very happy about that. The Southeast Asian nations are very happy about the Japanese behavior in the past decades. So we really hope that China, now that it's emerging, or it has already emerged as the biggest power in the region, will maintain what he said, the horizontal equal partnership with all the other nations in a very peaceful way. Do not act, refrain from acting. Self-restraint, I think, is the key for the biggest power in the region.
So let me go to you, Mr. Yang. So China has this, what China initiated, but eventually a platform, a Belt and Road Initiative. All parties, according to China's plan, is to win and win and win. On the other hand, China is the second largest economy in the world. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
And therefore, others see China differently these days. Thirdly, China is a country that is already become powerful before it becomes rich. You think about all the other economies, they have decades of so-called free time before they play a huge responsibility, both regionally and globally, after they become rich. United States, for example, only after the Second World War. But China differently, already being asked to play responsible role in the region and beyond. So, Mr. Yang, now under those circumstances, as complicated as they are, how do you see China's willingness to work with Japan also and to coordinate with Japan's plan for its own approach to the region and probably beyond? Mr. Yang.
Yeah. And first of all, I think China has to make itself better understood by the rest of the world. The way for Chinese to develop and Chinese, the real Chinese face or Chinese society today, you know, I don't think the people overseas understand Chinese so well. To be honest, both are responsible for such circumstances, I think. In my view, Japan plays a very big role in Chinese, for example, so far for Chinese reform and opening up, success. And from now on, it will continue to play a big role. Several aspects may I point to. One is in economic cooperation field. Second, in the regional cooperation, the whole picture, and we have to discuss with Japan. And third, about the surrounding area environment for China. In this regard, may I say, Japan has not only a constructive role, but also has a destructive role to play.
Meaning?
Meaning, if we don't enjoy a good relations with Japan, Japan will go to other side and to play an active role in the shaping of our outside environment.
As both of you said, we're going to observe very closely. There are a lot of nuances, a lot of changes that only makes our job ever more exciting, isn't it? Hopefully, also in the good direction. Thank you so much for both of you being with us. Thank you so much, Mr. Yang.
Thank you very much.